Hello, and welcome to Marketing to Complex Industries, presented by Godfrey, a B2B marketing agency for industries like yours. On each episode, we feature conversations about the latest challenges, strategies, and technologies for B2B marketers. I'm your host, Scott Trobaugh, VP of Creative at Godfrey, and today it is my honor and pleasure to welcome Carla Johnson to the podcast. Carla has lived, worked, and studied on 5 continents. She's worked with numerous Fortune 500 brands and just authored her 10th book, Rethink Innovation, which is currently available for pre-order. So we're very excited today to talk to Carla about innovation and all things marketing. Carla, welcome to Marketing to Complex Industries.
Thanks, Scott. I'm delighted to be here. You know, you have all of some of my favorite things. You've got B2B marketing, you've got complex industries, and of course, now today, innovation.
Wonderful. With a book with a title like Rethink Innovation, that already sounds like kind of a big promise. Sounds like a tall order, but you upped the ante and have a goal. You have a very special, very, very measurable numeric goal. Can you tell me about that?
Absolutely. It's my goal to teach 1 million people how to become innovative thinkers by the year 2025. And it was interesting how this popped into my head one day, because one of the things that I've noticed, and I think particularly with B2B marketers and the industries that we're in and the kind of companies that we work with, and I know you've heard this 100 times, Scott, is people say, I'm not that creative. I'm just, I'm not that innovative. We don't want to rock the boat. And, we know what we did last year worked, so we're just going to do it again and maybe dress it up and make it look a little different. But I don't know what to do. It's too risky. We don't have the kind of budget, we're not that kind of company and all these excuses. But I believe all we need for people to become more innovative thinkers is just to learn how. And I think there's so much pressure. And I think there's this stereotype of innovation and what it is, and that it is complex and expensive and time consuming and laborious. And I think that takes a lot of that stereotype, takes a lot of the joy out of what I've seen from people who do understand how innovation can be so simple and that you can use it for anything that you do.
I think that's really interesting. So, too often, in the book, you mentioned people overthinking things, thinking a little bit too much about it. And I think that there's an undercurrent of fear that goes into that. We tend to overthink things because we don't want to make mistakes. Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit about how you've gone about sort of tackling that and hitting that head on.
Well, I think one of the reasons that people have fear, and particularly this fear associated with the risk of trying something new, innovation. Innovation is all about finding new opportunities, solving problems that haven't been solved in the same way before. And I think the reason that people have so much fear is the unknown of what's on the other side. What if we come up with an idea to try something and it doesn't work and it fails and I lose my job and I lose my house and, I end up destitute in the streets? Our mind is amazing at coming up with all those negative scenarios, but we need to train it to think of, wait a minute, it doesn't have to go that way. All I need to do is look for an example of when it did work out really well, understand the details of why it worked out really well, and relate those characteristics into the work that I do. And right there, I have a little bit of a track record that can show me what to do that minimizes the risk of a new idea that I'm testing. And I think, especially as marketers, one of the things that we forget is that we test a lot. We test campaigns, we test, A/B formulas, we do a lot of testing, but we don't think about that approach when it comes to ideas and being a little bit more innovative. And I think if we look at that mindset that we have of looking for familiarity in the ideas that we bring to the table and adopting that idea of testing things and seeing what works and what doesn't, on a little bitty scale rather than this huge, grandiose, really risky scale, I think that does a lot to start to address the risk and the fear that people have around new ideas.
Well, I definitely want to talk more about that and where clarity, communication, and that sort of thing come into play. But when I think about risk and I think about that level of bravery and that kind of thing, I actually want to ask you, a little bit more of a personal question because you have gone and lived abroad at times for some fairly extended stays in other countries. It would seem to me that there's something of a sense of bravery and sort of a commitment to come what may. This is what we're going to do. That would come into that. Can you tell me about those experiences a little bit?
Yeah, and I'll start out with the first one because even though it was before we had kids and it was just my husband and I, um, we were earlier in our careers. It was 1998. You still have risk, and there's still
Mhm.
this sense of, well, what do I do with my house? What do I do with my car? What do I do with my stuff? What if I lose my stuff? But I think one of the greatest gifts that I learned out of that first year of living abroad, we went to South America for a year, is the freedom that comes from not having anything to worry about. We literally lived with everything on our back, and we weighed it at one point, and it was 27 pounds. So you think about living for a year with everything you need on your back, and it only weighs 27 pounds. Now, this was pre cell phone, pre laptops that were, really mobile, pre tablets and things like that. But
Mhm.
there were internet cafes, so we could communicate and ways to keep in touch. But it was the beauty of that freedom of understanding really how little we need to live on a day-to-day basis, and how little we need to be happy. And I think our budget for that year was something crazy like $40 a day. So when you
Mhm.
think about living the high life and traveling, that certainly wasn't us. I mean, there's hotels, there's nice hotels, there's hostels, and then there was where we stayed, where we could afford to go for that long. And now we did choose a continent that was very inexpensive to travel in, so I'll say that. But I think part of that gift of understanding how little you really need is to understand with clarity, to your point, about what matters most in what you do in life. And I would say that trip and that experience came at a time in my adulthood when I realized I didn't want a big house with a lot of stuff and a lot of cars. Life was just a lot simpler, and I had clarity about what mattered to me most because I lived with 27 pounds of stuff for a year. Now,
Yeah.
it's an approach that we've had with our kids. I mean, with kids comes stuff, right? You still need high chairs, you need, cribs, and you need toys and things like that. But I think that was the nice thing about then, fast forwarding to 2018 when we decided to take our three high school kids and live in Spain for a year, is that it was another opportunity. Now, as high schoolers, they're not big stuff people either. So it was easier, and they've traveled a lot. We've traveled a lot with them, and they had to carry everything that they had. But again, it's that idea of you may go without it for a year. And when we come back, let's see what really mattered and what was important. And it's funny how you can travel like that, and a lot of things that you have around you every single day don't really have the meaning that you thought they might. And so when you have all of this, like, fringe unnecessary things that aren't necessary scraped away from life, you really have room and space, mentally and physically, to figure out what does matter and what you do want to fill that space with. Or, maybe you leave some space empty.
I'm going to say I think that the South America trip that you're talking about, early on, early in your adulthood, that's almost the safer bet than taking three high school age kids. And I, as the father of three myself, I know you're dealing probably with three very distinct personalities there. That takes guts. We're going to go to Spain for a year, and everybody's going to enjoy it, right? We're gonna commit as a family. Like that takes leadership. It takes some guts. It takes some risk. But I would imagine that the payoff is really there as well.
It really has been there. It has been worth it. And I mean, who could have ever known what we were going to come back to, and, the complete lack of travel. now that we've
Yeah.
had this last year. And I think one of the wonderful things, I mean, we've always been a close family to start with, but when you spend all of your time with your teenagers in a foreign country, in a country that speaks a different language, it's a different kind of closeness. And you get to know people really well in ways that I think if we would have stayed home and had that year as typical American family and American teenagers, we wouldn't have gotten to know each other like that in that way. And I think that's, I mean, I give our kids a ton of credit because I can imagine a lot of teenagers who would have thrown fits, and it could have been a miserable year, going away with 3 high school kids, but they saw it really for the amazing experience that it was. And they did really embrace it. Now, it doesn't mean they didn't miss their friends. Doesn't mean that there were, it wasn't hard to adapt and get used to a different kind of schooling and everything like that. But it did give them a different perspective on what's possible if you just start to ask, what if, what if we did start to look at living abroad? What if we did start to look at, what does it take? What if we start to look at the details of a visa? What if we start to look at, how school could look differently? It really was our year of rethinking how we looked at the world, how we looked at our work, our family dynamics, how we looked at school. And I think that it is one of those lessons for all of us at all of our respective ages that will be just a tremendously impactful thing that matters to us for the rest of our lives.
It's interesting. When you talk about that what if kind of thinking, I think that is, anything that I've ever done, creatively for any of the brands that I've personally worked with. It's been some variation of what if, of that game of thinking broadly. What if we tried this? What if we did that? The more broadly you can think about that, I feel like the better and more innovative the ideas are. So I would imagine that those experiences do feed into your ability to write a book like Rethink Innovation. Tell me about the process for that and how what if kind of plays a role in that kind of work.
I'd like to say that the process was succinct, start to finish in a year. It was clear and all of those things, but it would be an outright lie. And it was a long process for me. It took me about 5 years. And in fact, the first speech I gave about the idea that turned into the process for this book was January of 2016. And
Wow.
I gave it at a B2B conference in New York City. And that was what I like to do is I test ideas in speeches. I test them in blog posts and, podcasts and different things to see what the response was. And the person who spoke right after me was Toni Clayton-Hine. And at the time she was the CMO of Xerox. And she got on stage and she said, I feel like Carla Johnson has been a fly on the wall in my office for the last 6 months, because she absolutely hit on what I see as a tremendous, challenge that we have. And for me, I have incredible respect for Toni, and it couldn't have been any bigger endorsement for the concept that turned into Rethink Innovation than what it was. And so it was a series of what ifs and tests and adjust this meandering path that turned into the book that we'll release at the end of June this year. And I think it was also an amazing experience for me as a writer. So my first book was published 20 years ago this year in 2001. And it was actually my master's thesis for my degree in history. And that was similar to this book in that it was all my idea. It was all my research. I had to do all of everything that went into it to prove an idea that I believed was valid. But the difference with this one is that it took a lot more research, and it wasn't just about looking at what had been done in the past, like you do with a history thesis, but talking about what the future could look like and actually rethinking how we imagine innovation and talking about, what if it wasn't just relegated to this small group of people, an innovation group, a product design group, something like that. What if everybody understood what it meant? What if we had such clarity about innovation and what it meant? What if everybody got involved? What if everybody understood a process and there wasn't fear and there wasn't this, looming sense of risk when it comes to a new idea. What if companies were more open to ideas? What would that look like? And I think from the what if, it transitioned into the next stage of, well, let's pretend. Let's pretend that is the case. Now, how do you see it playing out? Let's pretend you are an executive who wants to build a culture of original thinkers. How do you actually do that? And so it was very much a learning experience for me about, one, the story of innovation, but the story of how we perceive it and how our own identity as innovators or not innovators really has such an incredible impact on our bravery in stepping forward or raising our hand with a new idea. Something that simple, a new idea.
I like the fact that you're touching on identity, because I think that the way that we see ourselves and the way that we, the things that we tell ourselves on a regular basis, is probably the most tremendous contributor to whether or not we're going to be taking those risks. I mean, if I feel like, you know what, I'm a little bit of a rebel, I'm a little bit of a risk taker, I'm gonna bring these ideas forward, and if they fall on deaf ears, that's okay, because I know that I've got something to say. If you're taking that perspective versus on the other side of that would be somebody with imposter syndrome, which is all too common, something a lot of us deal with. That person's going to be likely to keep those ideas to themselves, and they're not going to be as likely to take those risks. So it would seem to me that that's really where it starts, kind of like fitness really begins in the kitchen. It's like, what you're feeding yourself, right? I would think that at the same time, with your creativity, it really depends on what you're feeding your own sort of emotional and mental self.
Oh, absolutely. And so if you look at companies that have a traditional like R&D group or an innovation group, people who are specifically tapped with that responsibility and that accepted identity, and you go into another department or group or a person in that company, and you ask them, think of different ways that we could do this more innovatively. They're like, that's not my job. That's what that group over there does. And I've had heads of innovation groups say to me, thank you for like opening the gates and having this be something that everybody should care about, because our group can only do so much innovation. And it's not about solving every single problem and jumping on every opportunity in the entire company, because like they don't have that kind of bandwidth. They don't have that kind of staffing. And the other thing that you hear from these people is, I'm not smart enough to be an innovator, because there's this perception you have to be a PhD, and in these complex B2B industries, a PhD engineer, a PhD data analyst, or you have to be a design thinker, or you have to be, fill in the blank with something that makes you an official innovator. And they're like, I'm not smart enough to innovate. And the truth is, innovation at its root is just about connecting the dots. And that's one of Steve Jobs' most famous quotes, is about, you can't see it by looking forward, but you can see it from back, looking back. It's about connecting the dots. And people say, just connect the dots, go forth and innovate. And that was something I read an interview with an executive about the other day, is that he was so frustrated because he couldn't get his employees to innovate. But the issue was, he's one of those natural dot connectors, and not everybody is, or not everybody remembers how to do it like we did as kids, because we are that way as kids. And so it's a reminder of what it looks like and how to do it. And really it's something that everybody in the organization needs to own, not just this little handful of people.
That's the part of it that I love, because, first off, it brings the message that you've got and sort of the methodology that you've got here to a much wider audience. Because it's sort of got this sidecar of you can, don't tell me you can't. The research is on my side. You can be innovative. But also you mentioned how we all do it as kids, and I remember seeing a TED talk with an education expert, Sir Ken Robinson, talking about convergent versus divergent thinking. And that really captured my attention when he said that the one group of people that tests 98% at the genius level for divergent thinking, which is that really open, very creative thinking, that really open mindset, is 5-year-olds. And that 5-year-olds naturally do this. And so if you've ever been 5 years old, which anybody listening to this has been at least once, it means that you were quite likely a genius at this innovative kind of thinking. And as we grow, we sort of learn to censor ourselves. We sort of learn to I love thinking that this is something that we're all capable of doing. And it's really about reducing the roadblocks that we put in place for ourselves, more so than trying to go out and grab something that we've never possessed.
Yeah, and it's that's one of the most incredible TED Talks, the one you talked about from Sir Ken Robinson. And I think one of the things that happens in corporate environments is we forget the divergent thinking and we focus so much on the convergent thinking because we want to find that answer and that one right answer, and we're just drive. And the statistics that he was referring to is some research that was done in the late 1960s by a gentleman named George Land. And George was a systems engineer who saw this need for greater creativity in business. So he started a company, and that's what they did, is study creativity and help organizations with creativity and divergent thinking and to become more innovative thinkers. And along the way, one of the directors at NASA came to him and said, I know we have incredibly creative engineers. I just don't know which ones they are. Can you create an assessment that helps us identify those most creative thinkers? And he said, absolutely. And he did it, and NASA was happy. And then he said to himself, I'm sure over coffee one morning, how did we get to the point where as kids, we can pick up a fork and it's, a dragon's talon, or you have a spare piece of fabric and it's a cape and you're a superhero? How do you go from being creative in everything that you do to being a person that no one can recognize as a creative thinker? So he adjusted his assessment and started out with this group of 1,600 5-year-olds. And you're right, 98% of them tested at the genius level of creativity. And so his question was, well, where do we lose this? And then so we studied them again when they were 10, and that 98% had dropped to 30%. By the time they were 15, it was down to 12%. And I think most truly heartbreaking is that when he looked at the results he had surveyed over 1 million adults, and they tested at 2% genius level. And so what we see there is, one, that there comes a time when that idea of how you think like a kid and the playfulness and the idea of possibilities and opportunities is taught and expected out of you. Now, I'm not saying we should have corporate environments where everybody acts like a 5-year-old, because there is that transition that you have to go through, the immaturity of a 5-year-old, to the maturity of a 50-year-old. But there are so many characteristics of how we think naturally as kids that's taught out of us in education and then reinforced with conformity in the corporate environment. And I know when you look at kids, and sometimes the ones who are the most brilliant are labeled as troublemakers because they can see all of these opportunities, and having to conform is really hard for them. And so, they end up maybe flunking out of school or dropping out of school or just getting so disgusted. And I think it's this huge amount of innovative brain power that we as a country are losing because we're trying to make everybody conform like a little factory. And then you pop out a graduate that goes to university and gets an MBA, and you think this way. And then, you come into the corporate environment, whether you're a marketer, a finance person, or a IT person, or heaven forbid, an innovator, and this is the way you innovate. And I think that's the great lost opportunity. It's one of the reasons I did the research into the 6 different kinds of archetypes and how they innovate. Because I know you and I may be similar because you're a creative director and I tend to be very, very right-brained. But that's very different from my brother, who's a PhD engineer. Now, does it mean he's more innovative than I am, or vice versa? Absolutely not. It just means how we approach the process comes from different dynamics. And both of them are very valid and very necessary, especially when we start to look at teams of innovators. but we have to understand and open our own definition of what innovation is, to rethink innovation, what it looks like, who's involved, and what those people look like.
Well, I think it's interesting. Once we understand that, and once we understand that everybody, possesses this potential still, that it's in there, that pilot light is still lit, right? And we really just need to learn how to kind of turn the burner on, so to speak. I think that's really where your book picks up, and it's about not so much about here's how to get creative, here's how to get innovative, but I almost felt like it's here's how to build a greenhouse where innovation can grow. Right? It's really plans to create a place where that magic can happen, and I'd like for you to talk a little bit more about that because it's simple to say like there's a 5-step process to it, but it really is about creating space.
It is.
I think more so.
Yeah. And it's one thing to have the process to understand how to consistently come up with these great ideas, but it's another to put it into practice in your
Mhm.
everyday life. It's one thing you talked about fitness begins in the kitchen. It's one thing to know what to do in the kitchen. It's another thing to actually do it, or in the
Yeah.
gym, or wherever else. And so that's one of the things that I wanted people to understand is that if we're looking to create these ecosystems of people who are truly prolific innovators, who are able to find these opportunities and make something happen with it that fits an objective of an organization. I don't want to give the impression that I believe when I say that innovation is everybody's job, that it's a big building full of cats running around and it's all crazy. It's actually very systematic and very focused. So for the left brain people listening, don't freak out. Like, it's not total chaos. But I think that's one of the most important things is that if we are looking at how do we create innovative organizations and create an entire ecosystem of original thinkers, if we're going to do it at the big level, we have to reverse engineer it down to the individual level. And so we have to be able to recognize that it does take everybody on an individual to understand, like, how do you come up with the idea that addresses a specific objective that matters to the business, to your team, to whatever the situation is. It can be something just as simple as, how do we make our next Zoom team meeting more interesting, so that we can get people to show up on time, to turn their cameras on, to actually speak up, to be engaged, so that we can get through our agenda faster and people leave it, feeling like they've accomplished more. It's that, like, it can work for something that simple. It can also work for things like we need a new customer experience portal that our customers will actually use or something like that. But it's that process. And so in order to create that environment, that greenhouse, like you talk about, the main thing that organizations have to start with is their own brand purpose. Why are they in business to start with? Because there's all sorts of research that shows when an entire company and employee base understands the reason that the company is in business, the difference that they're making in the lives of their customers, innovation skyrockets. And it's back to one of your earlier comments about just basic clarity and communication. So when you have that as your North Star for any organization, that's the fundamental foundational level of clarity and communication. Now, the next level is, what values do we need to have in place to make sure that innovation takes place in our culture like this? And are we willing to hire, fire, reward, and reprimand based on those values? Because unless you consistently reinforce the behavior that's represented by those values that makes innovation happen, then it's just another like nice poster slapped up on the wall in a conference room that people walk by and don't really pay attention to. So the organizations that really do care about innovation and innovative thinking and making it something that everybody participates in and has accountability for, they understand those two very, very first fundamental things.
I would think that from the standpoint of those core values, I would think that could potentially be hard. Like it strikes me that you don't ever really own those. You rent them and you kind of pay the rent every day, right? Because you have to maintain and you have to constantly be in pursuit of them. That in and of itself feels like a lot of work, worth it. But how do you engage a company of hundreds of people to do something like
And it's an interesting comment, because I think sometimes what happens is that it's easy to miss the translation of how we interact with people as a person versus how we do that in mass as an organization. So when you think
that? Mm-hmm.
about, brand purpose, is it easy to come up with? Not necessarily, but to your point, is it worth it? Absolutely. And you think about the people in your life who are like magnetic. And it's because whatever it is about them, what they stand for. And then you think about
Mm-hmm.
maybe this other person or group of people that you're like, they're so irritating and I just want to avoid them. And it's because they're like, hey, Scott, you like biking? I like biking too. Come on, let's go biking. Oh, like you'd rather go cook now? Okay, I like to cook too. I just got this new cookbook. Let's get together and cook. Brands behave that same way. And people are just magnetically attracted to the first and just repelled and repulsed by the second. Just like people, the same thing happens to a brand. And so when you look at not having the clarity of a brand purpose and you're going out and saying, we need to figure out what customers want so we can be that, it's no different than you as a person
Mm-hmm.
saying, I need to figure out what all my neighbors like, and then I'm going to be that person. It sounds ridiculous, right? It sounds ridiculous. It sounds hokey. Totally sounds like the last person you're going to invite to the, neighborhood picnic. And it's the
Yeah.
same dynamics. You have to understand as a brand who you are first, because that's your first filter for both your customers and your employees. So once you understand that, what your purpose is, and then you understand the core values that need to support that, it actually helps increase employee retention. It helps companies hire more qualified employees that fit the culture of the organization. It helps with getting higher quality candidates and things like that, because this company is very clear. This is who I am. And these are the values that I believe in that make this person or company true. And you can't have a company that says it professes one thing, but doesn't have the values in place to support it. And it's even more important the larger the organization, because you're looking at these companies that are 10,000, 50,000, 100,000. Some of them are global organizations. If you're going to behave, act, think, and innovate as one type of organization or organism, then you have to be able to understand the thinking that goes behind everything that you do. Why do you do it as a person? Why do you do it as an organization? And what's my individual little role in it? One of the stories I like to tell is of Park Mobile and their focus on innovation for everybody in their company. And they close their offices for a week twice a year. And that's the focus for everybody, is innovation. And so there's this woman who worked in finance. She didn't have an innovation background. She didn't have she wasn't software engineer. She wasn't a lot of these things that people think of as qualifications for being innovative. But she did have a process she had to do every single month that took her and her team 40 manual hours to do it. That was really sucking the life out of them. And so she taught herself a programming language and she automated that process. And it now takes 20 minutes a month instead of 40 hours a month. And so those are the kind of things that matters. But the reason she was able to do it is because Park Mobile is very clear about their purpose. They have the values in place to support it. And then they gave people space to actually innovate.
So it's really about that level of consistency, and I do think that is what brands are built on. When you think about a brand as a person and you think about those behaviors in an individual, that's where it gets very entertaining, right? And you talk about the neighbors and the folks who can be very annoying because they're always trying to just bend to the group. What they lack is essentially authenticity. You never really feel like you know that person versus someone who's very consistent. Even if you don't like them, you trust them. And I think that that's a really important distinction to make because there are brands that I do business with all the time that I don't particularly like, but I trust them because they're consistent. I may wish that they would do something differently or just talk about themselves better or something, but they're absolutely consistent and absolutely authentic with who they are and what they're about. And that's always paid off. I think that's a very important distinction to make, being liked versus being trusted. So that's really fascinating.
Yeah, it is. And I think that's one of the things that people miss in the busyness of business is that really
Mm-hmm.
important characteristic. And companies get so focused on, what is it we're selling? What is it we're marketing? Who are the people we're hiring, that they forget the whole reason that they're there to start with.
Yeah. And I'm sure a lot of people again make the wrong choices typically out of fear.
Yeah. Yeah,
I can
absolutely.
think of a
Because
lot of
because
scenarios where
they're
that
looking
happens.
for efficiency, I think.
Yeah.
And efficiency and innovation are two very, very different things. And I think especially as companies grow and get bigger, all of the inefficiencies are squeezed out for the sake of being profitable, of keeping expenses down, everything that comes with efficiency. But there's no space to be inefficient and to try things, to do the what ifs, to do the let's
Yeah.
pretend at whatever level. It doesn't have to be anything huge. It doesn't have to be innovation with a capital I all the time. The little bitty incremental innovations absolutely add up when you look at them across all employees, over long periods of time.
It's really, really cool. So, I did have a couple of questions that I had sent you ahead of time that I wanted to ask you. One of them being, what is the greatest like world changing work that you're seeing happen?
I think the work that I've seen that has made the greatest difference in this last year is some of the things that Microsoft has been doing with Microsoft Teams. I mean, I think for so many years it was Slack had just an amazing crown and this icon of team collaboration and how people interact. But I think there's been a lot of things that Microsoft has done in the last couple of years, especially when you talk about facilitating conversations and bringing people together as teams and how you keep people connected, and even the idea of removing friction at every point that you can to make a process easy. I think what Microsoft has
Mm-hmm.
done with Teams these last couple of years really has been, world class type of rethinking what the whole process of collaboration can look like.
I would agree with that. I mean, we've used it at Godfrey, and one of the things that I found is that like we have project management software and that kind of thing, but then we also have this sort of collaboration tool that we just naturally use for having those real time chats. We might do a quick phone call over it or something like that. We use it to throw files back and forth. And what I find is that it ends up being, because of the frictionless nature of it, it kind of becomes a magnetic. We have to remind ourselves to actually go fill in the project management stuff, like in the like single source of truth that we have over here, because
And everybody will go
in
back.
those collaboration spaces, it's just so easy to just sort of keep cranking.
Yeah.
Friction is I think a key point there.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think that they've just done an amazing job of being very, of seeing an incredible opportunity. And who knew what a great opportunity it was, when I think they started to do a lot of these different integrations in about 2019. And, lo and behold, here comes 2020 to pull the rug out from underneath everyone. And it was just, they were able to see an opportunity that turned into a tremendous opportunity to solve problems that they didn't even know were going to exist. But I think that's really the beauty of what they've done, is that they started to rethink what team collaboration could look like. And it worked out so well for so many people this last year.
I think this last year, for all of the difficulties and all of the frustrations and all of the overall tragedy of it, there's a lot of heavy stuff there. But I've also been amazed at the way people have been resourceful. Innovation comes into that, right? We needed to do it, but the technology, so much of it was stuff that we already had. This past year for me, on a broad scale, was really about adoption of technology and people getting comfortable with things years more quickly than they probably would have otherwise.
Oh, absolutely. And I know a year ago I saw companies who had been struggling with digital transformation and making it a priority for 5 years. And all of a
Mm-hmm.
sudden in 5 weeks they got stuff done.
Yeah,
So it's that sense of urgency. And I think that's what's so exciting about what we're seeing now and going forward is that everybody knows whatever happens next is going to be different. So there's no better time than right now to really take advantage of change, of doing something different, of innovating, of rethinking the work that you're doing, because we all know that page, that book, that huge volume of expectations of business and how we interact doesn't apply anymore. And we have this blank slate now. And I don't know, you as a creative person, you may have the same sense that I have. Like, I love opening a new notebook and getting my pen out and drawing those first lines and imagining what things are going to look like and what could be, the what ifs and the let's pretend. And I think we're at that tipping point
yeah,
right now in business with being able to do the exact same thing. But the thing that's to our benefit right now is that everybody expects it to look different. So that's our greatest opportunity is to design it in a way that is the most beneficial, the most helpful, the most valuable to everyone involved.
yeah. Yeah, I feel like because everybody's expecting things to be different, we were just talking about hybrid events, virtual versus in person, and what's the kind of middle ground going to be there. I feel like because everybody's expecting things to change, the risk that you're getting into with any kind of innovation right now is probably the lowest it's ever been. People are going to be more, they're going to be more agreeable, they're going to be more forgiving, they're going to be more willing to come along for the ride because we've just gotten used to doing that. It's like in terms of adopting new technology or getting comfortable with it. It's like 2020 was a swim coach and said, "Go stand by the deep end and close your eyes. I'll be there in a minute." We're just going to push us all in.
That's right.
Pretty much, it's and the water was cold, but you get used to it, right?
Yeah.
So
Toughen up a little bit. Yeah.
Stop crying. Why are you crying? Put your
There's no
mask on.
crying and swimming. Yeah.
That's fantastic. You found a way to work a Tom Hanks quote in. That's awesome. So, second question: what ideas, other than 2020 as swim coach, what ideas are most exciting to you right
I think I'm going to go back to the idea of the blank slate, truly, because it's a blank slate for everybody. There's been companies who have absolutely thrived in the last year, or industries. There's been others that have struggled. But I think the thing that excites me the most is there is no standard playbook anymore. And there is going to
now?
be a lot of redesigning, rethinking. Everybody's expectations are different, and a lot of them aren't even set. So I think that's what's most exciting is that we don't know what things are going to look like in 5 years, 5 months, much less 5 years. But this
Yeah.
truly is the time that we have to create and design business to look however we want it to look.
That's absolutely true. And I think about what comes out of stuff like this. My kids have grown up in a world where we have tons of cool food trucks in our town, and I didn't grow up with anything like that. And I have to remind them that during the economic downturn in like 2008, 2009, it was the fact that came at a time when we all were starting to get smartphones. Twitter was becoming a big thing. And then we had this downturn where somebody can't keep a restaurant open or is wanting to open one and has to come up with a more cost-effective way. They went to food trucks, and you can instantly connect with your customer base, let them know where you're going to be on Thursday for lunch. And it just sort of created this revolution and this new way to get this like mobile, like culinary, idea out there. And to my kids, it's just like the norm. They're just used to seeing food trucks around, and it's like your favorite restaurant. You have to go hunt for it.
Yeah.
It's a really fascinating seeing the way that those trends evolve from those times, and being able to sort of go back to it, kind of reverse engineer it and do that memory of why did that happen? I think is really fascinating in terms of just understanding how markets work.
Oh, absolutely. And it's such a good point, because that time, that 2008, 9, 10 with the housing bubble and financial crisis, was an incredibly innovative time. The same thing with the dot-com bubble in 2000, 2001, around then. You can go back through all of these really hard economic times and times of upheaval, and they're amazing sources of incredible innovation. And I think that's what's so exciting, because when times are good, nobody wants to rock the boat. Like, let's not mess with a good thing. Like, nobody wants to be that person to put their career on the line then. And so, now's that time to take advantage of all of it.
I think that's great because, from what I'm seeing in this book, you've essentially put together a playbook on how to rise to the occasion with that sort of thing. And that's what excites me so much. It's one of those where, as I've gone through it, I instantly, I'm like, I want to read this again. I want to talk to people about this. It's got, page after page, I just saw a ton of really sort of sticky ideas and really compelling material there for how to respond to times where innovation is needed. Be that a challenge within a company, because companies have ups and downs, or a challenge that's more on that global level, where it's that shared experience that we can all relate to. I honestly think it's an invaluable resource, and so thank you for writing it.
Thank you. And my hope with the book is that it would be something that, if somebody was told, like, go innovate, that they literally could take this book and step by step understand every detail of not only what to do and how to do it, but why to start thinking about it differently, to rethink innovation and the world that opens up when you start thinking about it a lot differently.
Yeah. Last question. If you could have one superpower, what would it be?
Oh, I think my superpower has always been that I wanted to move things with my mind. Yes. And I think this is particularly something that I wished when our kids were younger and they were misbehaving and I was on the other side of the room from them. Now it's more like I could just get a whole lot more done in a shorter amount of time with maybe less physical exertion from me. But that's always been one of my superpower wishes, is to be able to move things with my mind.
That's a good one, and I think I think not enough people choose that. You're always looking at flight, speed, or invisibility, maybe time travel. Yours is much more practical on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. I think it works for big crises, like when King Kong and Godzilla meet, and there's things that I would like to move out of the way, or just day-to-day things. It goes up and down the range of necessity, Scott.
Yeah. Well, I would. That makes a ton of sense to me. Talking about taking all your possessions with you and having them only weigh 27 pounds. Everyday life for the rest of us in a typical housing environment, there's a lot more to lift and a lot more to carry.
That's right. I think just all the stuff on top of my desk every day weighs more than 27 pounds anymore. Yeah.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for sitting down with us today. I really appreciate that. It's been a joy to talk with you. This book, you said it's going to be out in late June?
Yeah, June 29th, but you can pre-order now. which I encourage you to do.
Very good. And just all the typical places people could find books, I would assume, right?
Absolutely. Just any place where all great books are sold.
Wonderful. Carla, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Scott. I'm delighted to be here. And I love this conversation.
Marketing to Complex Industries has been presented by Godfrey, a B2B marketing agency for industries like yours. Godfrey is built for technical products, discerning buyers, and intricate buying cycles. For more information, visit us at godfrey.com.